Welcome to the 3030 Health Podcast. The following discussion is for education and entertainment. It is not intended to diagnose or treat disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first discussing it with your doctor. Here is your host, Dr. Ruiz.
Hello everyone, super excited about my guest today. My guest today is Dr. Evan Hirsch. Dr. Evan is the best-selling author of Fix Your Fatigue, the 4-step process to resolving chronic fatigue, achieving abundant energy, and reclaiming your life, and one of the nation's leaders on finding the root causes of chronic fatigue and resolving them. When he's not at the office, you can find him singing musicals, playing basketball, traveling, and spending time with his wife and daughter. Also, I am super excited to announce the Thyroid Reset Summit. Join me and my friends to discuss the hidden causes of Hashimoto's thyroiditis or autoimmune thyroid disease. We talk about detoxification, HPA axis dysregulation, and all of those symptoms associated with thyroid disease. You can sign up for free and watch this summit online. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello everyone, super excited to be here with my friend Dr. Evan Hirsch. Dr. Hirsch, how's it going?
It's great, Guillermo. Thanks so much for having me on.
Man, we've been trying to schedule this podcast for what it seems like to be 2 years. And, for one reason or another, we weren't connecting and our schedules weren't working. But finally, I heard about Dr. Hirsch from Ari Whitten's The Energy Blueprint. He specializes in one of the most difficult areas within functional medicine. I think the only area that might be a little bit more difficult than what you do is cancer. But, second closely is what you do. But before we get into that, Dr. Hirsch, in true 30-30 fashion, what is your hero story? How did you come into functional medicine and helping people in this way?
Thanks for asking, Guillermo. So, I started off, I grew up in New Jersey, and I knew I wanted to help people. I was good at science, so I wanted to be an MD. I didn't know anything about chiropractors or naturopaths growing up in the 80s, and in Jersey anyway. And so I went off to medical school and went into residency and came out west and met my wife. And a month into our relationship, she got fatigue. So here I am, I'm going through my family medicine residency program, and I'm asking everybody about fatigue and saying, hey, what are the treatments, what's available? And they really didn't have much for me, all these attendings that I'm talking to. And I started reading, I started going to conferences, and I just kind of started layering things. I learned about holistic medicine. I got board certified in integrative holistic medicine. I learned about functional medicine. I learned about environmental medicine. And I kind of put it all together, and I was able, it took her 3 years to get better, and I was able to help her a little bit. Most of the stuff that she was working on was emotional, and she made huge shifts and was able to get over her fatigue. But then I got fatigue, and I was down for 5 years. And I kept finding, different causes, and I would work on them, and I would improve just a little bit until I found the next cause, and then I would work on that. And then I put that all into my book, and I've helped thousands of people now, and through my one-on-ones, get over their fatigue and achieve the best energy of lives. And now I'm on a mission to help 1 million people. So, I'm so thankful that you've got me on today so I can help spread the word.
Yeah, definitely. And within fatigue, because it's such a nebulous concept, what are you focusing on?
So what I have found is that there's really, if we want to simplify it, is that it's really all about the causes. Most people are looking for the treatments. They're like, oh, is it glutathione? Is it B12? Blah, 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 blah. And what I have found is that there are 15 different causes of fatigue. And the reason why it's so hard to treat is because everybody has multiple causes and everybody has different multiple causes. So Jane over here, she's going to have, mold and Lyme and adrenal fatigue. And Joe over here is going to have thyroid and Bartonella and something else. And so they're going to both have fatigue plus other symptoms, but they're going to look very different. And so that's why my approach is really all about figuring out exactly what causes they have, because it's only once you find the causes that you can really find the treatments and get them better.
in my own practice, working with endocrinology, we do, most of the patients that I see have started treating, some of those endocrinology causes, Hashimoto's, Graves, you name it, HPA axis dysfunction. 90% of the patients that I treat, it's very straightforward. The root cause, it's usually bad digestion, shitty lifestyle. So helping with sleep, but then you do get some people that have hidden infections, and it is difficult to treat for two reasons. First reason is because to diagnose, it is kind of difficult to diagnose some of these hidden infections. And then the second, that even if you have a diagnosis, let's say, of Bartonella or a diagnosis of EBV, treating is difficult, okay? So tell us, like, what your rubric is. Like, how do you go about diagnosing something like EBV? Because, like, you'll hear people say, well, everyone has had EBV.
Right. But not everybody has a reactivation, and so yeah, most of us have had it. And so that exactly right is the challenge, is the diagnosis. And it's funny because I'm doing a lecture on this tomorrow night, all about how to diagnose based off of symptoms, because you said it, the labs are really inconsistent. Even the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta say that the two-tiered method, the ELISA with the Western blot, is really only for epidemiologic studies. It's not for clinical diagnosis. And so they recommend that, clinical diagnosis really should be made more on symptoms. And so differentiating these stealth infections based on symptoms is so important. So that's the one thing. The other thing about the testing is that you've got serology testing. You've got these two branches mainly, which is serology testing, which is the immune system's reactivity to the bug. And that's really dependent on an intact immune system. So if you have heavy metals, chemicals, molds, or other infections, the immune system's often left field and cannot be present in order to give you an accurate response to these infections, right? And then you've got PCR testing, which is really looking at like the DNA of the bug. A lot of these bugs are existing in the lymph system or in other parts of the body, so they're hidden. And if you're measuring them in the blood, you're not really going to find them. I find that the best test really is a urine PCR test, but you have to provocate it. You have to push the bugs out of the lymph system by having a lymph massage or having 30 minutes of exercise. So it's not easy to test based off of that. So then you have to look at, and I always recommend that we use all of the possible data that we have available. If we have labs, when we have symptoms, if we have any sort of other objective data, physical exam, even muscle testing or something like that, bringing all that together can really give us the best picture. So when I dive into supplements with folks, or sorry, not supplements, symptoms, I'm looking really at some of these differentiators. So with Epstein-Barr, a lot of times it's a diagnosis of exclusion. The reason why it's so challenging too is that they're pretty non-specific. You're talking about fatigue, you're talking about memory loss, you're talking about enlarged lymph nodes, you're talking about brain fog. Those are kind of the big things. You don't have some of these other symptoms associated that are more specific. Like with Bartonella, you get the muscle cramps and you get the pain on the bottom of the feet and you get the neck pain and the sleep problems, or Babesia, where you're sweating all the time and you've got really bad moods, anxiety, depression, stuff like that. So you don't have some of these more specifics. It is more general, which I think sometimes makes it even harder to diagnose.
And once you have a diagnosis, once you have identified that it is a viral infection, or it's a comorbidity from a viral infection, how do you go about treating? Are you using retrovirals? Are you using radiation? What is it that you're recommending?
So I'm a big fan of nature. But I also like to use things that are really strong. So I use very strong herbs because I want to move the needle. But going through residency, we know that the number three cause of death in this country is medications. Over 100,000 people every year. I do not like using antibiotics. I do not like using antivirals because a lot of times what they are is they're bacteriostatic or viral static, where they're stopping the replication. But then when you stop those things, the bug just comes back. So we got to go deeper. And so the herbs are really awesome for doing that. And I really like the Byron White formulas. Those are disease specific, and sometimes you have to combine them in a certain way. But herbs really are my main go to. Now, once again, 15 different causes of fatigue. Infections is going to be one cause, and if people aren't going to have success just by going after the infections, which is typically the case, it's because they don't have the immune system on board, and that's because the immune system has been hijacked by heavy metals, chemicals, and molds. So those also have to be remedied in order to be able to get that immune system back online so we can work with the herbs to get rid of the infections.
We met online at the message board of the Energy Blueprint, and we met in real life at a conference, at a training, and we geeked out for the weekend about botanical medicine, because I've done a lot of botanical research on the benchtop with antivirals and antibacterials, and I have a bunch of published papers on that. But Dr. Hirsch has a lot of clinical experience, and he introduced me to the Byron White formulations, and how they're specifically made to potentiate them, and that was that was pretty cool to discover this other area of herbology or botanical medicine that I was completely unaware of. So we've gone, like this nebulous, symptoms, and then, coming to you, and then you diagnose. What are some labs that you're using to diagnose for, like for example, EBV or Lyme? Because those are probably the most controversial labs that are being that are discussed within the health sphere.
Yes. So I like DNA connections. And so that's connections with an X, DNA, CONNEXIONS.com. So that test is a urine PCR test. So that's what I talked about with the provocation test, where you have a lymph massage beforehand or a half an hour of intense exercise. If you can do that, a lot of my clients cannot do that. But that kind of pushes the bugs out, and then you're getting them tested. Now, the other good thing about this test is that you're looking at a lot of the different strains. So we now know that there are hundreds of species of Babesia, of Bartonella, of Borrelia. So a lot of times it's not just, Borrelia burgdorferi or Bartonella Hensley. There's all these different strains, and so it's very important. That are coming over from Europe or from different parts of the country. Very important to test several of them, and so that's kind of what the PCR test is doing, and that is my favorite. With Epstein-Barr, I still use serologies. That's not being done in the urine test. So I am looking at IgMs on Epstein-Barr. I don't believe that IgGs are indicative of reactivity. It's still not entirely clear, but I'm sure you agree with me.
I agree 1,000%.
So that's important to look at so that people can determine, whether or not they have Epstein-Barr or not.
I started this podcast as a restart into this health journey. I believe that, there's people that have spent 10, 15 years researching on their own and trying to do, as much to get themselves better. And we have become very sophisticated with our jargon and talking about this stuff, But there are people that maybe they're coming of age right now to where they're taking care of themselves now, and they're like, 10 years ago I didn't feel like this. For the people that are just getting a hold of this information, what the hell is IgG? What's the difference between IgG and IgM? Why is that important?
Great question. So the immune system will react to these infections, and there's lots of different components of the immune system, but the standard of care is to look at immunoglobulins. um, as a measure to see whether or not the bug is actually present. So it's this indirect look at the infection. It's looking at the immune system's reactivity. So if something is on the skin and you're reacting to it, it's immunoglobulin E, as in Evan. If something is acutely reactive, where basically like you have an infection, you form the immune system forms these very big molecules called IgM, M as in Mary, where they come and they kind of are first line, they're killing those things, and then it sends a message back to the immune system so that it has a memory of these things, and that's IgG, as in good. And then there are several other forms as well, but those are kind of the big ones that sometimes you hear about when people are talking about food allergies or looking at infections. And in looking at infections, we're looking at IgM and IgG. So that's why we were talking about, IgM is if there is an acute infection present, where the immune system is fighting it off. Otherwise, the IgG really is more of a memory of, hey, you saw this infection before, and next time you see it, you're going to react a lot faster because the IgGs, just like our little jackrabbits, they come out, they take care of things quickly, as opposed to these big lumbering IgMs, which are stronger, but they're not as fast, so they're not good memory cells.
And I've had a lot of patients that come in with IgG serology with pretty intensive treatments for their IgG infection of EBV, and sometimes that can interfere with your ability to heal because you're using this huge protocols, whether to bombard the digestive system or to do this pretty intensive IVs in order to fix something that doesn't need fixing. And we're like, I take some time from my visit to explain why we don't treat IgG. And then they asked me, so how come my doctor didn't say that to me? Well, and I don't know. But in reality, if you have reactivity in the IgG, and it, to a certain extent, because some serology with IgG could be a very early infection. If you have like the viral capsid and blah blah blah, and we can geek out on that. But if your only reactions are IgG, you're probably barking up the wrong tree.
Yeah, and I think that the reason why practitioners do that is just because they they're not finding anything else. They can't figure it out. It's not making sense to them. And then so they're kind of stretching and say, well, we're seeing this thing here, and this could indicate. And we want to use, as much of the science as we can available. And it's not great when it comes to lab testing, but that is one of the things. If you don't have symptoms of EBV and somebody's got elevated IgG, you shouldn't go treating. And the other thing that I see too is what I call the whack-a-mole effect, where, you start going after one infection and you upset, the terrain, and all of a sudden other infections start popping up. It's kind of like that game at the fair, where one mole pops up, you hit it, and then the other one pops up. And so it's not uncommon for me to see this. And sometimes it happens during normal treatment, but oftentimes it happens if you're not treating the right bug.
And what upsets me is that if we were using treatments that weren't so aggressive, but sometimes, we see these treatments that are very efficacious, but are like bombarding the system. Maybe instead of using, a powerful antiviral, maybe if you think maybe this IgG serology could be something, instead of bombarding with antiviral botanicals, maybe doing maybe an adaptogenic herb to try to modulate, that is going to be a little bit gentler and pretty good, and support the immune system, but not disrupt the flora or even the viral flora that we have. So now you're from the Northeast, and I think that you have seen this wave of Lyme disease and how it has expanded, and now it's getting as far down as the Southwest. So for people that might have an inkling that they might have Lyme disease, what are, you talked about Bartonella and you talked about EBV. What are some symptoms where you say, Okay, you might not have a tick on you, or you might not have that bullseye rash, but maybe we should test you for Lyme.
There are some cardinal signs of Lyme, or what we call Borrelia, because they're really, Lyme is kind of a misnomer because now it's like Lyme type infections. We're looking when we say Lyme, we're now talking about all of these different infections. So in terms of Borrelia, the cardinal signs really are symptoms that come and go. You've got good days and you've got bad days, and they migrate around the body. And so sometimes it's joint pain that moves every couple of days. Sometimes it's nerve pain. Sometimes it's muscle pain. So, but you have to have good days and you have to have bad days. And there's really nothing else that does this. So that's kind of the cardinal sign of Borrelia. So if you have Babesia on top of it, those symptoms are going to be 3 times worse. And that's when you can start to get things like paralysis, like really bad neuropathies, numbness and tingling, really bad burning throughout the body. So let's talk about Babesia. So if anybody has any of those symptoms, it definitely recommend getting it checked. A lot of these weird and mysterious symptoms, you've been seeing lots of doctors, nobody can explain them. A lot of times that's Lyme. Babesia, as I mentioned before, this is kind of like an intracellular infection, so it lives inside the cell,
And those are
and
so hard to treat.
they're very hard to
Yeah.
treat, and they look a lot like malaria. So they give you fevers, and these people are running warm most of the time. Like oftentimes it'll be like 20 degrees outside and they'll be taking their shirts off. They're like, I'm always the warmest person in the room. It's kind of like they have like high thyroid or something, like taking too much thyroid. They're also sweating quite often, day sweats, sometimes night sweats, and usually drenching sweats, where they're like, yep, I'm constantly soaked. They have really awful sleep, hard time falling asleep, hard time staying asleep, and they have really bad mood issues. So anxiety to the point of panic, and depression to the point of suicidal thoughts. And then they usually have a chronic cough or some sort of lung condition because it likes to live in the lungs. So that's kind of the conglomeration of symptoms associated with Babesia. And then Bartonella is the next big one, which I've found just so incredibly interesting because people showing up with these conglomeration of symptoms where they'll have headaches and neck pain, back pain, muscle pain. A lot of people with fibromyalgia have Bartonella. They'll have problems sleeping, just not as bad as Babesia. They'll have anxiety and depression, just not as bad as Babesia. They'll have pain on the bottom of the feet, usually misdiagnosed as plantar fasciitis. So people who are watching this would say, gosh, I've never heard anybody talk about that before, but it's usually like a soreness on the bottom of the feet. Oftentimes they also have muscle cramps, usually at night. They're taking magnesium for it, or they're trying to drink as much water as they can. Sometimes they'll have stretch marks or these striae, which will show up unrelated to weight loss or weight gain, sometimes on the flanks, sometimes on the legs. Um, and sometimes they'll have these cherry red little dots, kind of a rash throughout the body. And then sometimes they'll have Raynaud's, which is kind of like your hands will turn, white or blue in the cold. You find that you're running cold a lot. Oftentimes, these people have thyroid issues. In fact, the only way that I've ever been able to get people off of thyroid medicine is by treating Bartonella. I had some serendipitous stuff happen where people who are on thyroid got hyperthyroid as soon as I started treating Bartonella, and I was able to wean them off their thyroid medication. I find about 50% of everybody who's got thyroid issues and Bartonella can get off of their thyroid medication to a particular degree.
That's very interesting because there is in the literature molecular mimicry from EBV is one of the causes for Hashimoto's. That correlation, it's pretty specific. Not food sensitivities, not specifically an EBV infection. And you have to have the trigger and you have to have the gun and blah blah blah. But yeah, it very common.
And I think that there's so much of that happening in the body where, if the infection is going to be attacking a certain part of the body, that you get inflammation and pain in that part of the body. So if it's drawn to the thyroid, you get, regardless of the infection, you're going to get thyroid issues. If it's drawn to the joints, you're going to get arthritis. If it's drawn to the skin, you're going to get lupus. So I think certain infections gravitate towards certain parts of the body, like you're talking about with Epstein-Barr. But I think there's so much that we don't understand about, what triggers that and why certain infections go some places, and sometimes why, they're going to go to multiple places.
And it just gives, people that might think that you're making it up or you're crazy or, some hope. And that is, half the battle, finding someone that is going to listen to you. So tell us about the connection between this intracellular infection. So I love intracellular pathogens, because they're so crazy cool. For example, some intracellular pathways downregulate the vitamin D receptors in cells, so they hide from your immune system. Another cool one, and this is these are the effects of this intracellular pathways on your body. A very famous one, and one that I've talked a lot about, is the anemia of chronic disease. Like, for example, malaria, which is an intracellular organism. The malaria needs iron in order to reproduce and continue to grow. And your body hides iron from malaria, so malaria can't reproduce. And there's this really good article from the WHO where some good Samaritans went to Africa and they started testing kids for anemia, and they had their ferritin was low. They gave them iron, and then they had fulminant malaria infections. And the WHO now has very specific guidelines that if you are going to administer iron in this malaria infested zones of the world, you got to have a robust anti-malaria protocol. And I've seen people that have had maybe low iron, and they just tell them, just take that red pill that makes you constipated, and they feel worse, and nothing happens. And that's why it's so important that if you have anemia, we investigate why. Why is it the anemia? And more often than not, is a hidden infection.
I think that the iron question is so incredibly interesting because we check like 4 different markers for iron, and the body is doing some very weird things, or the infections are doing some very weird things with sequestering the iron, taking it, putting it in different parts of the body. Why it's elevated, it seems like in some parts, why it's not in other parts. How elevated iron can be a problem in cardiac disease, where you want to get the iron off, and yet in other parts, you really need to replace it. So I think that story of iron has not been fully written yet, but research is incredibly interesting. I hadn't heard of that before, but it makes really good sense with what I'm seeing as well. Like when I see people with low iron and they've got infections, I don't replace it.
And it's funny because you do need iron in order to oxidize bacteria. So, and you need iron in order to convert T4 into T3. So it's like this dance that you have to make, and you better be damn sure that if you're replacing iron, you're doing something against hidden infections. Unless you have an ulcer, unless you have, maybe someone with really heavy periods. Because I'm telling you, you can give an iron IV, and it's like putting a warm blanket over someone. They feel better immediately, but that could be fuel for the infection. So it's a really cool dance that you have to. I'll send you all the papers on that, on the malaria. It's a fascinating story. What about the gut connection? How do you address the gut connection, and how do you because it is true, a lot of people have had EBV infections. In most people at some point we get infected, and that's why we have positive IgG serology. But how come some people develop the disease or this nebulous symptoms, and other people don't?
Well, I tell people that, it really takes some triggers. It takes some stressful hits, in order for the immune system to get untoward, and the upended, and the infections to really take flight per se. So I'm looking at heavy metals. I'm looking at chemicals, I'm looking at molds, and so I find that those things really hijack the immune system and allow these infections to become opportunistic, because most of these infections are in us for years, if not since birth. Like I got my Bartonella from my mom. I know that. So a lot of these things we get vertically from mom. Moms dump all their good stuff and all their bad stuff into the babies, and so you can have all of these bugs in your body for your entire life, and they're not going to become opportunistic until you have a number of stressful events. I can't even tell you how many people get car accidents or motor vehicle accidents or traumatic brain injuries, and they end up with this post concussive syndrome. And what it really is that they upended their stress system and their hypothalamic pituitary oat axis, where all the hormones and all the regulation of the hormones isn't working well, and their immune system is not working well. And so much of these infections that have just been lying dormant become opportunistic because the hormones are not managing the immune system, and then the immune system is not managing the infections, because the immune system really is there to kind of keep them at bay, make sure that they're in balance. We know all about how important these bugs are, right? We're 90% bug cell, 10% human cell. And so these bugs are super important, but it's when we get that imbalance. And so there's these stressful events can really cause these bugs to become opportunistic.
And you see that all the time, specifically with thyroid patients, we see that hypothyroidism usually is triggered after the birth of a child, and talk about like one of the most stressful events in your life. In fact, the first Graves patient was diagnosed after a fall from stairs. So this lady fell off the stairs and then developed hyperthyroidism. So that stressful moment triggered the immune system to start attacking the thyroid to produce more thyroid hormone than you needed. And we began this interview talking about that emotional connection and, how your wife first started using that emotional connection to heal herself, and eventually it came around to where did you find hidden infections in your wife?
Yes. And it's really interesting because her labs don't look good, but she feels great. So it's really interesting, this combination about, I mean, she worked on all of her emotional trauma and really went through some, getting rid of a lot of the crap that she was kind of stressing her out, and all these patterns that we have. But yeah, so yeah, she's just doing amazingly well. So what I found is that it's really that combination, and we're starting to work together for the first time on our new group coaching program, where she's going to be teaching and I'm going to be teaching as well. So I'm really excited to make sure that we're approaching every single one of these causes.
So, what are the basics? We always talk about the basics, and we talk about sleep, we talk about nutrition, we talk about exercise. What are your basics? Because if I have someone with post-exertional fatigue, now that's a difference. That's another story. Where people that those mitochondria become inactivated, and the only way to activate them is to exercise. But you don't have the mitochondria to give you the energy for exercise, so you do a little bit of exercise, and then you feel completely drained. So, what are the basics when someone comes in with maybe multiple infections? Where do you begin?
I don't even begin with the infections. So I'm going to start off first with replacing. So my 4-step program is to assess, determine what the causes they have, and then replace, and then detoxify, and then remove the crap. Crap is a medical term, by the
Yeah,
way.
yeah. The ICD-10 is somewhere there.
It's there. So it's really all about replacing, because that's the fastest way that people are going to start to feel better, so that then they can focus on a bunch of this other stuff. So replacing nutrient deficiencies, so B12 and magnesium, replacing hormones, so adrenals, thyroid, sex hormones, making sure that they're drinking enough water, replacing any sort of dehydration that they have, replacing their sleep, making sure that they're sleeping well. And a lot of times their sleep issues are circadian rhythm issues, where the body doesn't know what wake is and what sleep is. And once you start replacing B12 and magnesium and adrenals and thyroid, all of a sudden they are recreating that circadian rhythm. So then they're sleeping better anyway. Usually sometimes you don't have to give them anything at night. You can just give them that stuff in the morning. So, and then food, obviously, you can't get better if you're eating crap. And I definitely advocate for a paleo diet, Mediterranean diet, low on grains, low on sugars, big on vegetables. Half the plate is vegetables, a little bit of fruit, protein, that sort of thing. So that's kind of the ideal diet with variations. And then organics, or eating as much organic food as possible. But those are kind of my big ones. And people can't change their food until they start to feel better. So once we get that replacement going, a month in, they're feeling better, they've got a couple ticks up on their energy, then we start in on the food, because food can be so stressful, and food does have a huge emotional component to it. And so I try to be really gentle with people and say, hey, if this isn't working for you right now, we're going to come back to it. But those are kind of my big things until they're able to start moving. And then it's like, 5 minutes of jumping jacks, or five jumping jacks a day, like whatever they can do initially to kind of get things moving. We all know what a panacea is, exercise, that it heals everything, or so many things. So we want to get that moving. We want to get them moving as soon as possible, but you got to start low and you got to go slow.
Yeah, and it's so important, going back to the food aspect of things. I think that, social media as a tool to reach people, and, we're using this podcast to reach people, and, it's amazing. But sometimes, when we compare ourselves to other people that are going through this health journey, and then you see what they're eating, and then you feel inadequate because your food looks like, crap. And then you see all these beautiful recipes, and, and if I was to take a picture of everything that I ate, I would not win any awards for appetizing or anything. Like tonight, I'm having some grass-fed ground beef that's gonna be shaped like a burger patty with some collard greens, and that's it. And guess what I'm gonna have for lunch? The same damn thing. And it's and it's not, it doesn't photograph really well, but I know that it has all my B vitamins. I know it has, my folate. It has all of the things that I need. And I just want to tell everyone that's listening that it's okay. It's okay to be repetitive with your food. It's okay to eat things that might not look like, like a amazing recipe, as long as they're nutritious for you. And it's okay to divorce yourself from the thought that breakfast should be breakfast food and dinner should be, dinner food. If you like salads and it's easy and convenient for you to have a salad for breakfast, go for it. And if you're a busy parent and the only thing that you can, that you have the energy to is to fry a couple of eggs and maybe, some spinach and make an omelet or whatever, it's okay, and that is just so, to me, that was such an eye-opening moment when I realized that. And then I have people say, well, you are able to eat like that because you don't like food. I'm a foodie, it's just that I'm a foodie when I'm on vacation, and I'm a foodie when it's appropriate, but 90% of my food is boring as hell. And just creating those systems, especially when you're fighting something like a hidden infection or a comorbidity or something like that, being consistent with your habits and creating those habits is 10 times more important than having a Instagram ready meal.
And I tell people it's got to be baby steps. The first thing that I tell people is I say, okay, let's convert your diet to gluten free, but don't change what you're eating. So, okay, eat your pasta, eat your bread, just make sure it's all gluten free. It's really hard on families and stuff like that. So it is these baby steps, and then once you get to your point, where things are basic, and you've got a really good diet, then you can start experimenting. Once you have the energy, then you can look at some of these paleo cookbooks and you can make it start tasting good, and you start adding in spices and stuff like that. Then you can make it taste. I feel like, we're not deprived, we're gluten-free, dairy-free. My daughter's she's 10, she's been since the day she was born. And I feel like, we've got great palates and we really enjoy our food. My wife's a great cook. So I think that you can step up from that where, once you get to that place where you're eating right, you can start to tweak it and then you can start making it taste better. But yeah, I totally get what you're saying.
Yeah, and especially, seeing all these pressures, or like the pressure to work out every day, and you see all these models and you see all these people, influencers online, and doing crazy shit on, at the gym, and you long to be able to do something like a fraction of that. Take your time. It's more important to take those baby steps and create those systems first, and then in turn you will be there. So, in just switching gears a little bit, you mentioned mold a couple of times. It's funny because I've seen mold cases in Arizona. Talk about like how prevalent it is. Why? How do you test? And what are some of the symptoms that someone should be looking for, especially in places like the Northwest, or like maybe Florida, or places that are way more humid.
And that's where I am. I'm in the Northwest. I'm up in Seattle. And so, it is a bit nebulous. Oftentimes there is fatigue. People will experience sometimes some symptoms of fungal dysbiosis, and so they got like they may have some fungus rashes going on. They may have some sinus issues. They may have some neuropathies, but the fatigue really is debilitating. And so what I always use is I love the urine mycotoxin test to determine whether or not there is some mold in somebody's body. And so that's a test to determine whether or not your body has the toxins produced by mold. And I find it to be the most accurate one available. And so once we figure that out, and I do a provocation with glutathione on it. So once again, trying to push the stuff out of the lymph, out of the hidden places so that you can get a good urine test. And once you figure that out, then you have to determine whether or not you are currently in a place with mold or whether or not it's coming from your past. And I use the ERMI test, environmental relative mold index, which is basically a DNA test for mold in your environment, or the HERTS-Me test, HERTS-Me 2, which is a few less markers. But this is what I have found to be the absolute best way to determine what's going on in your home. Is your home toxic? Is it not? Because if it's not, then great. Then we know that it's from the past, and that home that you grew up in that had leaks, a busted pipe, a flood every summer, a leak in the roof, all of these things, then we know that that's what it's from. But if it's not clean, then you really have to remediate it, which it's quite challenging to find the right people to remediate, especially with a guarantee. Or you need to move out to a different place, and it's tragic when sometimes somebody moves out to a different place and they're still in mold. So you have to make sure that you're doing the testing before you move into a place. And to give you an idea about how bad this is, you talked about it being in Arizona, is that about 50% of all buildings in this country have water damage, and most of those have mold. And so it's incredibly prevalent, and it causes such a problem for people. I have a chapter in my book that talks about the title is Why Husbands Don't Believe Their Wives When It Comes to Mold. And this is because there are certain genetic SNPs, genetic issues that are present on the X chromosome but not on the Y chromosome that make women more susceptible to this. So if a woman feels crappy in their home, the husband does not. The husband doesn't believe there's a problem, unfortunately. And so then there's conflict because I'm telling the woman that let's test, and the husband doesn't really want to spend the money on it. So it definitely can be a challenge. But one of the things that people can do is if they get out of the home for a good 5 days, and usually getting out of the area to a drier climate, because you can get out of the home here in the Pacific Northwest, but the humidity being up at 50, 60, 70%, where mold grows at around 60% or so, you're still going to have the mold growing in your body. But if you go to Arizona for 5 days or more, you're going to notice a real difference where all of a sudden you're like, gosh, I felt so better. Day 5 hit, and I felt like I was a new person. It's like there's something either at your home or at your work where you've got mold exposure.
To piggyback on that, what about, I do a lot of chelation, metal chelations. What about people that say, hey, so where the hell did I get the lead? Where the hell did I get the mercury?
It's a great question. And, we can, they have lists, about where you could potentially have gotten this from, but oftentimes it comes from, vertical transmission. So it comes from your mom, through the placenta. And we now know that those heavy metals get more concentrated the more they come down the path. So if your grandma gave it to your mother, who then gave it to you, it's going to be more concentrated in you than it was in your grandma and consequently more toxic. So there's that, and then there's obviously all the environmental exposures, and so I try to, you know, did you grow up near a lead gasoline station? Did you play with, lead paint or lead ceramics? Did you eat tuna fish as a kid like I did? I had tons of mercury from mercury fillings as well as from eating a lot of tuna fish growing up, and constipation just made it all, just that much worse. And so, oftentimes we don't know. All we know is that we have to get it out and we have to make sure that you're not being exposed to it presently.
And I've also noticed regionally, like for example, people from the coast will have a little bit higher mercury levels. People from like New Mexico, they'll come higher on like the more radioactive isotopes, like cesium, and and it makes total sense. And then like I imagine people from Michigan are gonna have higher levels of lead, because of the water, and that's why I am such a big proponent that if you are in your reproductive age and you are even thinking about maybe getting pregnant, once you're thinking about that, let's do some toxic metal investigation before the baby is conceived, or you're even thinking about conceiving. If you want to have kids, I think it's so necessary to do some metal chelation even if you don't have symptoms.
Right. Well, and even with the infections, though usually people have symptoms of that, but they've done, I've heard of cases where people have had miscarriages and they've tested the babies and the babies have Lyme. So it can be a big problem, especially with people who've had multiple miscarriages, where they're, the mother just transmits this to the kids along with the other toxicities, and it challenges the reproductive or the development process.
Do you ever do any Marcons testing or any mold testing on the sinuses?
I used to do more Marcons testing. I don't so much these days because I base it more on symptoms. So if somebody's got symptoms and I have them, use xylitol to break up the biofilm and then some silver up the nose and I'm not having success, I know that there are some gram-positive organisms in there for the most part. And so oftentimes I'm going to use herbs that are going to go after MRSA, or they're going to go after some of these Marcons based infections that, when I'm not having success. But yeah, I will use that test if I get to a point where I'm not having success.
Have you seen the new product by Exlear? I think it's Exlear Plus or something like that.
I haven't. I like
So,
that product.
that's on my arsenal. I love that xylitol spray. There's a new one that has grapefruit seed extract. So they use grapefruit seed extract as a preservative, but it also has a little bit of tea tree, a little bit, like, it has a really nice combination of different botanicals at a little bit higher concentration. And I don't want my listeners to go out and buy it if you have a sinus infection, because you can create resistance. But it's if you have a sinus infection, I would rather use that first as a first line than going back spray or something a little bit more caustic. But it's it, like, those guys, that company is a pretty cool company. I've met one of the heads of the company at a conference, and they really know what they're doing. And but the combination of the Exlear with all those herbs, pretty cool, pretty cool.
That's very cool. And you mentioned the beg spray, the BEG spray for Marcons, and I had someone with hearing loss, and I won't use it again. I mean, their hearing came back, but I just won't use it because of the gentamicin in there. So I'm always looking at other options available. But I found, I take those Byron White formulas, and I'll put them into the Xlear bottle or into like a Neomed in combination with like some xylitol or something like that. And I've just found it to be incredibly potent and have them shoot it up the nose.
Cool. Yeah, and super interesting. Because I've had people that had chronic sinus infections for ever. And we did a Marcons test. The Marcons came back positive. We treated, and they're gone. And then the coolest thing about that test is that it also tests for mold. And it's a pretty cool test. But I can see, I don't see as many hidden infections as you do because I do more endocrinology. But I can see how if you're seeing this, might as well treat, with some salvo. Something funny that I forgot to ask you about was glutathione for as a challenge. I've heard of N-acetylcysteine as a challenge. And the idea of using N-acetylcysteine as a challenge is to remove some of the biofilm, especially when you're doing like a stool analysis. So if you've had patients that I've done a microstool analysis before and nothing came back, you give them a pretty good dose of N-acetylcysteine. You kind of remove the biofilm, and all of a sudden, the floodgates open. How does the glutathione help as a challenge?
Well, I don't know specifically, but mainly I'm using it, for removing mycotoxins. And so it's, I see it as obviously it's the main detoxifier in the body and antioxidant. And it was actually recommended to me by one of the labs that has the urine mycotoxin tests. And they said, if you find you're not getting the test showing up positive, oftentimes it could be that the mycotoxins are more hidden, and this is a good way of flushing them out. So don't entirely understand the mechanism, but it seems to work well.
Now, how do you dose it? Do you do intravenously or do you do oral liposomal?
Yep, I'll do liposomal 500 milligrams twice a day for a week prior, and then on like day 7, then you do the urinary test.
Super interesting stuff. I hope we gave some hope to people that are listening and that are so desperate in order to to get rid of this fatigue. How can people reach to you? How can people work with you? Any links or anything? And then I see a really cool book behind you. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so if they go to my website, which is fixyourfatigue.org, that's FIXYOURFATIGUE, fixyourfatigue.org. I've got everything there. My book has been very fortunate, #1 bestseller on Amazon, and you can purchase that. It's actually a free download as a PDF on my website, so it costs you nothing if you want to read it. And I've put in, a lot of action steps for you, at the end of every single chapter. So if you've got brain fog and fatigue, like I know that most of you do, if you're looking at that book, then you can get the action steps that you need. And so I try to create a tiered system here where that's $0. The Kindle book is $5. The paperback is 18, and then I've got the group coaching coming out, and then obviously the highest cost is one-on-one working with me. But you can find all that stuff on the website. You can click on apply to work with me if you want to see if we're a good fit. We can get on a phone call together and see how I can help you. So, I'm on this mission to help 1 million people resolve their fatigue. And so I just really appreciate you having me on and helping me get the word out.
Awesome. I know we're gonna run into each other at conferences, and we're gonna continue, helping people, whether in message boards or just through our interactions. But I so appreciate you coming to the show. It was about time you did it, and I hope. Have you seen the Mary Poppins musical, the new one?
Yes,
How
it's
was
great.
it? I haven't. So Dr. Hirsch, Evan, and me, we geeked out on science and herbology, but our true passion are musicals. So we've been talking about musicals every once in a while, and this dude has seen everything.
I've seen a lot of stuff. I didn't see the Hedwig that you saw, but
Oh man, yeah.
I just came back from Manhattan and I saw the Cher show and I saw My Fair Lady, a buddy of mine was in it, and so we went backstage, which was a lot of fun. But yeah, and we saw the prom, which was super amazing. If you haven't listened to the prom, I highly recommend it. It's not for kids, but it's awesome.
Awesome. I have something to put on my iPhone.
Yeah, it's hilarious. It's a musical comedy.
Cool, cool. Yeah, and I need to go see Lin-Manuel Miranda and Mary Poppins, and I wish I could go to Puerto Rico and see him perform Hamilton again.
Oh
Oh
yeah, that would
man,
be epic.
that would be pretty epic. Well, so awesome to talk to you. I hope to have you again. Let's wait, 6 months, and if I have some questions on Facebook, maybe we'll do a Facebook Live. We'll have you again, and let's get those million peoples this year.
Amen.
Awesome, dude. I'll talk to you soon.